But obviously the challenge made by SYRIZA and the vote of the Greek people since the new year has transformed attitudes and the dynamics in Europe in a way that probably wasn't considered possible a year ago. And the question is it going to end, in a sense, tears of the humiliation of SYRIZA, or can it lead to something more? And probably within that there is the basic issue of the structure and character of the Eurozone and how far its basic architecture means that it's always going to be neoliberal, set on the terms of the corporations and big business, or how far there is a room for reform and change within the structures of the Eurozone and the EU. And this has been a major debate within the trade union movement that has fluctuated back and forth since the 1970s. In the 1970s, the position of the TUC, the STUC, all trade unions, and about half the Labour Party was that the EU was irredeemably neoliberal, anti-working class. In the 1980s, opinion swung back, largely as a result of Jacques Delors and the Social Charter, to say that, in fact, the EU could protect workers against the worst of Thatcherism. Over the recent period, again, a movement, I think, back towards a much greater scepticism in the trade union movement and elsewhere about the European Union because of the austerity cuts it's been enforcing. But nonetheless, there is still the belief that possibly change is possible within the EU and within the Eurozone, and I think that is the key thing that we've got to debate today. I don't want to speak for too long. I've handed round a handout which some people might have seen. There aren't enough for everybody. I thought there would only be about 15 or 16 people here, and there's probably twice that number. But on it, if I can just remind myself of what's there, there is the National Reform Programme of the United Kingdom as submitted to the European Union. And that specifies that they will eliminate the deficit within 4 years and how they're going to do it. So that is in fact Osborne's programme, no deficit by 2020, 2019 in fact. And then there's the assessment by the Institute of Fiscal Studies about what that's going to mean. It's going to mean the cuts we've so far seen are as nothing to what's going to come in the next 3 or 4 years. Then below that, you see the text of the Treaty on Stability, Coordination and Governance, passed by 26 nations, agreed by 26 nations of the European Union in 2012, which specifies about the nature of deficits. No country in future should have a deficit not 3%, but 0.5. So that is why the balanced budget becomes necessary. And that will be mandatory on all those countries. By the final clause, it looks like, and it's difficult to interpret EU law and how it's going to operate, but they say within 5 years of this coming into force, which was in fact 2013, within 5 years it should become the law of the European Union. At the moment it's only of those signatories, those 26 member signatories. So that's that. There is the ETUC statement. The European Trade Union Congress usually doesn't say much about the European Union or against it because it gets paid by it. But on this occasion, if you read it through, and it's dominated by the German unions, which are generally, for obvious reasons, fairly pro-EU, but on this occasion, it actually says that what is inherent in that 2012 document of the Fiscal Compact is directly anti-working class and will destroy the interests of working people in Europe. And then finally, there's a quote from Unite Policy. Jackson will be giving me gold stars for this. Unite Policy, July 2014, which unequivocally condemns aspects of these EU policies. So these are some readings for you. And the other thing I'm going to pass round are two things. One is the Troika policy on Greece for privatisation, the so-called policy of national renewal, and one particular part of it, what's called, and it's a very nice term, the Hellenic Republic's Asset Development Fund. What's asset development? You know it, Ray, yes, you've seen it, yeah. And it lists all the things. You wouldn't believe just how much. Real estate, company shares, rights. The shares in all the Athens International Airports and all the other ones. Shares in Hellenic Petroleum. A number of things, I don't know what they are. The water supply, sewerage, the ports, the post system, telephony, the mobile spectrum, the lottery system, gas storage, three of the biggest banks, and the motorways, all to be privatised. And the other thing which you will find at the back of that is the settlement that the new government in Greece, the SYRIZA government, has put forward to the Eurogroup last week. There's the full details of that. And you can see just how much they've had to trim, change, and modify their original demands in order to be able to get something that might be accepted. Their first proposals weren't accepted, they've now put forward further proposals, which now do oblige them to commit themselves to various forms of budget stringency, including, unfortunately, areas of wages and workers' rights, it would seem, reading through, although they also try and shift the main balance towards tax evasion. Read it through. I think Prem's sitting here somewhere. He could read it through as an accountant and make some assessment of it. But of course, that has got to be reassessed by these auditors and accountants on behalf of the Troika, the three groups, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the EU Commission. It's got to be reassessed within 4 months, and if it doesn't measure up to what they really want, they will again put further screws on the Greek government. So that's to frame the question for discussion, because it basically is, can you operate any form of policy that bucks the corporations and bucks what they're trying to do, the project that we were told about by Prem and Jackson earlier, that austerity isn't anything about getting the economy right, it's about screwing down the workers in the interests of maximising profit and preventing a crash financially within our bizarre capitalist system that's now reached a stage which, unless it can get that maximum profit, crashes, as we saw in 2008. So what is it about? Can the Eurozone function as something within which workers can work? What should we learn from SYRIZA, and how can we develop the movement against austerity in solidarity across Europe? And we were going to have, of course, Angela Sabina, who would have been talking about Portugal, who've had a draconian austerity program, not quite as bad as Greece, but almost as bad as Greece, but which they have so far managed to largely resist because of an extremely strong trade union movement. But I'm sure the EU Commission will come for them as well. So that's my introduction. We've got, how much time do we have? We're supposed to be getting back in. We've allowed an hour for the, when's the final session meant to start? Is it 2:30? Yeah. 2:30. So we've got actually almost an hour to have debate and discussion. So who's going to come in with the first point of view? Ray.
Exciting times, and they're also quite enlightening times as well. We're meeting today talking about a policy programme to oppose austerity. And there's meetings going on now in the United Kingdom and all over Europe about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Programme, TPP, the Comprehensive Economic Trading Agreement and Trade and Services Agreement, which are all an attempt by transnational corporations to capture global politics, the global economy and global social forces. And we've really got our backs up against it. And those organisations that are fighting against these so-called free trade agreements are omitting to mention the granddaddy of every free trade agreement, which is the European Union's single market. And that was the first free trade agreement on a big scale that was signed off by the Thatcher government. And it's a weakness on the part of the movement not to recognise that the attacks inherent in TTP and all the rest are also inherent in the European single market. And I really believe that the ruling class across the world have made their mind up. They are going for broke. They're going to give the working class of Europe and the world a hiding that they've never had before unless we get our act together. And we'll never get our act together unless we learn the lessons of what's happened in Greece. The people in Greece voted for a government that said it was going to oppose the austerity programme, it was going to oppose the policies of the Troika, it was going to take the arguments to the heart of Europe and all the rest of it. And what happened? The lead negotiators went back to Athens, frankly, with their tail between their legs, because the capitalist class at international level said, so far and no further. And SYRIZA's efforts have foundered on that rock of international capitalist resistance. Now, how on earth do we marshal our forces in a period of decline compared to what we had in the 70s, the strength and influence was? How do we galvanise our forces in that period of decline to fight that type of blood and guts challenge? And we've got to really come into the box fighting. We've got to recognise that SYRIZA, and probably, in all possibility, Podemos in Spain, as social movements, have inherent weaknesses. And I'm going to argue that here in Scotland, the Radical Independence Campaign, Podemos in Spain and SYRIZA in Greece are all much of a muchness. They lack a definite economic and political analysis of what's actually going on. And so Kate Mark speech is saying, I want a new type of politics. We want new this, we want new... All we've got to do is say this is what we want. Hey, come on, we'll have an election and we'll vote, and because we live in a democracy, our vote will carry. Well, we should have known by now. That democracy doesn't work in the European Union. They said to the Greeks and the Italians, what, 2 or 3 years ago, and by the way, we didn't like your democratic governments, we're going to put technocrats in to run the country. They said to the people of France and Ireland, when they had a vote on the Lisbon Treaty, oh, you voted the wrong way. Come on, you'll keep on voting till you vote the right way. They're not interested in democracy, they couldn't get monkeys about social movements if they're not hitting profits. So we've really got to analyse exactly what's going on. And I'm telling you, to be quite blunt, I see it, the major weakness is the size of the Communist Party in every European Union member state, especially in Britain. And if we're going to develop a serious fight back that's going to hold out the possibility of victory and not lead to defeat after defeat after defeat that just breeds support for fascism, if we're going to seriously counteract this attack on our rights, we need to galvanise around the programme of the Communist Party in Greece, in Portugal, in Britain, in Spain, in France and in Germany. If we didn't do that, we're on to a hiding to nothing. And we've really got to get beyond this Achilles heel in the trade union labour movement. The anti-communism, the anti-Stalinism and the pro-Trotsky support that undermines that united fight back, based on the only power we've got to guarantee success, the organised working class and the trade union and labour movement. It's as serious as that.
Thanks. That's a very combative statement. I'm sure that will get others coming in. Let's see who else wants. Well, I can see Simon. I think Simon might be saying the same thing.
No.
All right. All right, Simon.
Well, I just slightly contest the John's remarks about the transformative nature of the vote for SYRIZA. Yes, it did transform to some extent people's expectations and the sense of what was actually possible to achieve within the giving order. But unfortunately, over the last few weeks, it has also confirmed what a lot of people thought about the nature of social democracy and the way in which social democracy functions in a situation of not just crisis, but extreme capitalist crisis. And I think we can learn from the Greek experience, actually, very directly. And I think we need to be clear that there is no crisis of the National Health Service. There is no crisis of the education system, of benefits and pensions. There is no crisis in the public sector. What there is a crisis of capitalism. It's the system that is actually functioning. And actually, the system is not failing. The system is working very, very effectively. And that's the way in which I think we need to see things. And that relates directly to how we actually project the left's alternative. What is the left alternative? Yes, we need to project an alternative in an immediate policy and programmatic sense. We need policies and a programme that can mobilise people in the mass. But we also need to link that explicitly and directly with the class end of the movement, and that is socialism. And to the kind of naked, raving class power of the Tories and all the things that go with that. We need to pose our own power, our potential, our own power, and our own organisations to those of the ruling class and political representatives. And actually, we can only do that over the long term if we're clear about the nature of the alternative we're fighting for. Yes, we can talk about more money for the health service. Yes, we can talk about the public sector increasing its scope and so on and so forth. Bringing industries that have been privatised over the last 20, 30 years back into public ownership. Yes, we can fight for all of these things, but at the end of the day, what will give these policy demands and programmes teeth will be their linkage to an explicit demand for socialism. We need socialism, even the very mentioning of the public sector, for example, certainly from a left point of view. What does the call for public ownership actually raise? It raises the question of the state. For us, the key question must be what kind of state? Is it going to be a state whose primary function is to oversee the management of the crisis that we're in, is now on terms and in a way that is favourable to the ruling class? Or is it going to be a fight, a determined struggle, sharp fight for the real alternative? Because the real alternative is not social democracy. The real alternative is not a general improvement of conditions within what we've got now. The real alternative is socialism. And, as Greg said, it is the simple thing so hard to achieve, but we need to make that explicit linkage between what we do now, what we as a left argue for, in terms of public ownership, pensions and all the rest of it, to our overall strategic demand, which actually must be socialism. Because unless we do that, what we do will always be subject to question. It will always be subject to being kind of rolled back and so on and so forth. So I think yes, we can learn very much from the Greek experience. And yes, the situation in SYRIZA, yes, there was a developing mass movement against austerity and what have you. Yes, it transforms not just the Greek people's understanding or sense of what was necessary to do and possible to achieve, but it also confirmed something that we cannot be any longer content with simply staying within this current structure of capitalism. And the issue of the state and state power is absolutely critical here, and certainly in Greece, how many general strikes have there been? The problem of general strikes is that every time you have one, it poses in a very sharp way the nature of political power. It poses the question of power. And I think we, not just as a labour movement in this country, not just the Communist Party in this country, but the entire European labour movement, the international working class movement, really, there is a terrible sense of urgency about this now. we know what's going to happen. By the time all of these zero budget deficits have been implemented in full and what have you across Europe by 2018, on the back of horrendous, absolutely horrendous situations that we will be forced to live under. So yes, we need a policy in conclusion, we need the policies and a programme for the immediate and the medium term, but these need to be explicitly linked to the strategic movement towards socialism. It seems to be that the discussion here and the plenary session later on this afternoon must necessarily focus on how we actually in practice make that link between what we're doing now and the fight for socialism.
Thanks very much, Simon. Who wants to come in next? John, and then over there, and Mike. Okay. Sorry, and Zoe. Yeah.
See, the thing is, though, the Greek people had a political vehicle to speak against austerity. We don't have that here in Britain. We have the Labour Party, basically pro-European, they are pro-austerity. But well, at least the Greek people had a stark choice. Here is, you can put your eggs next to this person here, and they will be anti-austerity. We don't have that here in Britain.
That's a good point. Now, I've forgotten what it was. Was it yourself? Yes, and then Mike.
I think there's also a conflict within the ruling class itself about the direction. And Prem raised a point that's been stuck in my mind for quite a while about the inability to distinguish between assets and liabilities. And the drive there, the connection with assets, was unproductive assets, debt fuel, investment in regeneration, property. Look what's happening with house prices in London. That's the kind of asset market that it looks for. On the other hand, liabilities, as far as working class people means, really getting into debt. But from their point of view, it's credit, it's loan companies, payday loan companies we set up, pawn shops, all that kind of thing. And I think there is a split within the ruling class. As opposed to the financial elite at the top, more folk in the ruling class will begin to realise that this is actually an insane path that we're on, that we need to get back into producing. And I would like to know from Prem, how does that outlook affect the allocation of capital and the distribution of capital?
Okay, I think we could possibly halt here and ask Prem to answer that question, take advantage of his presence.
Not sure how many days an hour that kind of analysis. You got to understand the world of business is not driven by these kind of social concerns. It's driven by private interest. That is what shaped any notion of cost, income, expense, asset, liability. Just to give you a crude illustration, everybody here, even on the left, accepts workers get a wage. And accountant will say wage is a cost. That's a shocking way to describe wages and salaries as a cost. Cost means it is a burden. It's a negative. You must get rid of it. Reduce it as soon as you can. There is no way an accountant will regard payment to capital as a cost. It is a reward. There's not a single accounting book you will find on this planet which has a chapter on how to control return on capital. But there will be tomes on how to reduce wages, how to control labour. So I think there is a whole sea change needed in thinking about this. And that's the kind of point I was making in my evidence to the Parliamentary Banking Standards Commission. I was called up for oral evidence. And there are bankers talking about how to take risks and how they get a return. So they're talking about making investment and return. And my point was, and actually Lord Lawson understood this, and Andrew Thierry did too, and I said, actually, these people are talking about private interest. A bank can be reckless in taking risk and get a return, and shareholders rub their hand and saying good investment, but that is disastrous for system as a whole. You cannot project private interest vocabulary and the ways of doing things to make sense of the bigger picture. And interestingly, they accepted that proposal in their report. They said two things. One, conventional accounts are of no use for making social decisions. And they recommended that the regulators need a very different set of accounts, which means we got to, on the left, have an opportunity to craft that. Second, they argued that when it came to the world of banking, and this is quite revolutionary coming from a bunch of Tories, they said shareholder supremacy should be removed when you come to regulating the financial system. You've got to look at it from the system, if you like, point of view. Because regulators and the government have to be concerned with stabilizing the system, which is very different from anything else. There were the 2 points, amongst others I made, some just went down like lead balloons, which they accepted. So on the left, we have not developed the vocabularies, not the systems for developing these things. So the first thing we have to do is, for example, change the ways companies measure profit. I would argue, and everybody here I'm sure would agree, that if you want to generate wealth, it requires cooperation between providers of, if you like, human capital, that is labour, finance capital, social capital. State provides healthcare, education, and many other things, and each is entitled to a return. Therefore, there is no question of saying which one is a burden, which is a cost. Okay? They're all entitled to a return. Then the question becomes how you distribute the cake, not who's already labelled as a burden. I'll argue that in academic papers. If anybody's interested, send me an email or I'll send you my academic papers. So we need a complete sea change. I've been to talk at the UN. I've spoken at the fringe meetings of the OECD, spoken to French members of Parliament. There's very little understanding of these things because they have a very monochromatic view. So what we are talking about here is very, very sensible, but we need to develop ways. And I'm sure if we begin reshaping these things, they in a sense will have kind of consequences. But many of these liabilities which the governments talk about are not really liabilities as such, because I was saying earlier, debt is asset. Generates income. Governments generate income. Anybody who saves, puts money in a bank building society gets a return. So we need to get away from this positivist conventional ways of thinking about the thing, and that is what I would recommend we do and begin work in developing different things. So otherwise I need a couple of days to talk about it. Thank you.
That was very helpful, Prem. It kind of also focuses the discussion because is Ros coming in to tell us we've run out of time? No, she's coming to join the discussion.
Coming at the right time.
Coming at the right time. Well, that focuses, in a sense, the question, because we've had two different points of view here. In a sense, those who are saying, well, it's the system that's got to change, and in a sense, Prem's saying, no, he doesn't mean it in that sense either, I don't think, but he's managing to convince some of the people in Parliament, even Tories, that you need to change the system in order to make it work. And that answers, I think, James's question. Are some of the people in charge of this mad system actually becoming concerned about it? So let's take it forward. Mike, and then there was somebody over here, I saw Zoe, and then I. Okay?
I just wanted to answer, was it Ray Penny?
Yeah.
Something you said earlier on, because in Greece, what happened in the election is that the parties which wanted to leave the euro and take Greece further away from the European Union, they didn't get sufficient votes, they didn't get significant votes, in fact, if you look at what happened there. And the Greens got an overwhelming vote. problem that SYRIZA has is that there's a very strong alignment of forces against it, not least of which, as you know, will be ECB and a fairly unified capitalist class across the European Union. What's making it worse for them is that the social democratic forces in places like Italy and Spain want SYRIZA to fail because they're not against austerity. Now, these forces which are against SYRIZA, they can create all kinds of mayhem because they've got strong levers, like they can orchestrate bank runs on the bank and decide jurisdictions on the bank. So they've got a very tough struggle ahead of them. But they seem to be doing what they can in the circumstances, and they are going to improve the tax base. That will take quite a time, well, it will take some time. But also, big companies have accumulated surpluses which they're not reinvesting, and the investment rate in the group is very low. And SYRIZA could find ways to develop an investment-led, state-led program and find ways to force those companies to invest. So I think it's too early to say that they're defeated. I think they've had a huge setback, but they've also managed to win some concession. What I want to emphasise is that what's coming up in Spain, I think there's going to be an election this year, and if Podemos kind of gain the seats that they're expected to gain, Spain's a much larger economy than Greece, and there's also, not this year, but next year, I think there's elections in Ireland where Sinn Féin may become, for the first time, part of a coalition running the 26th county. And Sinn Féin had an explicitly program, one of the few parties with a mass voting base in Europe. And I think that what we need to do is show the utmost solidarity for these struggles coming ahead. And I don't think we should pull ourselves back from giving support to these forces.
Thanks very much.
It's quite clear that SYRIZA would need to have left the EU and the euro in order to oppose austerity. Should they have set up their own currency? Could they have done that? Should they have defaulted on their loan repayment? Could they have done that? And could they have got a loan from somewhere else? Like, what was the strategy beyond leaving the euro and the EU?
That's a question you've thrown out. Iceland did it. Capital controls and massive devaluation, but at the same time have maintained now a growth rate that's higher than any other country, I think, in Europe. So that's a very small economy, but they managed to do it. But that's just making a point, not coming into the discussion. Alan should be next.
Yeah, I mean, there are anti-austerity movements throughout Europe, in virtually every country, and obviously some are much more powerful than they are in others. And in the case of Greece, they've been able to win power at governmental level, and there are others which look as if they may be able to do that in Spain and possibly Italy and perhaps elsewhere. I think the difficulty is whether the anti-austerity movement across Europe was powerful enough to change the nature of the European Union. And the difficulty of doing that is that the way in which the competition law and the principle of Thatcherite economics, if you like, neoliberalism in its most naked form, is written into the very DNA of the EU. And it's extraordinarily difficult to change it unless you had the votes of every member state, all 28 member states at the present time. So under these circumstances, if an anti-austerity government is elected in any country, then all it can do is save itself. It can save its own country. It cannot, in my opinion, take on the job of transforming the whole of the European Union, especially when there are such powerful resources are used against it. And it seems to me that, and you'd agree with Zoe, because no one else had said it up to then, it seems to me that the real option is, does it have critical mass, does it have the support of the electorate to be able to say, we need to withdraw from the euro, we need to default on our debts, we need to develop devalue the drachma, and we need to start the economy growing again, because that's the only way we'll get out of this trap which they're in. There is no other way, it seems to be, and the problem with the course that SYRIZA is taking at the present time is that it's quite likely to divide the movement and weaken it, and possibly at the same time weaken the anti-austerity campaigns in other parts of the world as well. The danger for the EU and for the German bankers who are most exposed to this situation is that one country gets special terms and
that was opposing SYRIZA. But SYRIZA itself, in terms of its electoral position, said we must keep within the EU and the Eurozone. And that meant that people who were frightened about losing maybe some of their savings if a devaluation occurred felt they could vote for SYRIZA. So they managed to get whatever it was, 36% of the vote. But they've got that hostage to fortune. The people who elected them think that they're going to be still in the Eurozone. And the people in Frankfurt know that, and they can use it against them. So that is the weakness of their position, is how you move forward from that. But anyway, that's on the EU and SYRIZA and the fight against austerity across Europe. We need to have, and this is the point of these kind of conferences, and I think we can take heart from the fact that it's pretty well attended and there's a very high level of discussion, I thought. We've got to get that clarity out in there in the movement, because there isn't that clarity at the moment. There's the same kind of populism, well, you know, we can maybe get this if we just say this and vote that way, without that clear understanding. That's what we've got to get if we're going to get a movement that really has got the power to do something. But anyway, who else is going to come in, or do we? Yeah.
It's driving austerity across Europe. It's also driving austerity much worse in the UK, and that's one of the things. That's one of the reasons why coup was engineered in UK, because the elected president was trying to steer them to a much better outcome rather than the savage austerity that the EU was offering.
And of course, the EU has got a linkage with NATO in terms of Clause 48 in the Lisbon Treaty, whereby it has to honour commitments of its member states to NATO. So there's a very close link between the EU and NATO, which is must be of great concern. Okay, I think we probably are near to drawing this thing to a conclusion. I think it's been a very good discussion. I'm not sure we can draw it to a conclusion that everybody agrees with, but there may be certain things that people could agree with, that the battle against austerity across Europe is beginning to get people seeing some of the realities of what you could call class power and how it is exercised, beginning to. The institutions that have been enforcing class power, which would be those we've just been talking about, NATO, to some extent, it's not really seen by most people, but the EU is being now looked at, I think, more closely. Again, most people don't see it as something that is going to directly impact on them. They don't see it as operating for the big companies and also for the very rich in all the member states, which is what it is. But there's beginning to be that realization, and a realization of the kind of things that Prem was talking about, that austerity, which is enforced not just by our government, but by collectively the EU, is not a matter of debt, it is a project to destroy the trade union and labour movement further. It's already been massively destroyed. So there's beginning to be, I think there's a consensus that we agree on that. And I think there's also a consensus that we need to fight back on local immediate issues in communities and in trade unions, in collective bargaining insofar as we've still got it. And that in this country the People's Assembly is crucially important for that. Again, it doesn't really have yet a mass profile, but it's got to be developed, because that's the only thing that can unite trade unions in general and the communities, and it is not party political. And I think that's very important, because at the moment one of the great dangers is a corrosive cynicism about all parties. I think we have to say the People's Assembly has a programme, may not be as sharp as we'd like, but it's got a programme that is anti-austerity, exposes austerity, and then try and win as many as we can from any political party to take a position on that platform. And there are people in the Labour Party, like Neil Findlay or Ian Davidson, who would commit themselves to that. There are hopefully people inside the SNP who will commit themselves to that, and in other parties as well. Don't think there's anybody in the Conservative Party, but certainly in those two parties there are. And build an understanding we've got to fight politically, because ultimately it will be a political fight in the Parliament after the election that will decide the profile of how we go forward. But the key thing is going to be that greater understanding of what the objectives of workers must be immediately. Collective bargaining against austerity, maximum pressure, building that unity, but ultimately the point that has been made earlier in this meeting, that it has got to be an understanding of the need for socialism, not in a kind of wishy-washy way, but an understanding of how we're going to get socialism, about the need to change the state power that enforces capitalist interests, and what it is, what represents them, not just the British state, but also the EU and the IMF and the other institutions across the world that represent big business, including TTIP. So I don't know, does that sum us up a bit? Yeah, there are probably lots of things that divide us, but if we can agree on that, that's a good starting point. Okay, and we've got our final session starting, I think, immediately, 12:30. Okay.
Thank you.